Hello and welcome. Today I am joined by Mandy Johnson, who is consultant physio, as well as now, I've just found out now, which is very exciting, lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, which is literally about 2 minutes away down that way. So Mandy, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you for asking me. It's a pleasure.
So I'd love to find out a bit more about you. Again, we've interacted a long time ago, but I'd really just like to find out more about you, where you're from originally.
Right, well, born and bred Manchester, so very biased towards this city, and went to Salford to do physiotherapy. And when I did physiotherapy, they didn't have degrees. That hadn't even been invented at that time. So we spent a lot of time in hospitals doing clinical work, but always involved in sport. I mean, I was a runner and a swimmer myself. So that's where all my friends were, etc. So always involved in sport. So I knew I wanted to be a physio or a PE teacher, but thankfully, in retrospectively, I'm thankful that I did choose physio. So even when I was training as a physio, I was working with swimmers, doing dry land work and stuff like that. And then when I qualified, the normal route then was to go into a hospital, spend 2 or 3 years in a hospital, and I was in Manchester first, and then I moved down to London. And you just get an experience in all the different departments, and then you're supposed to, choose which one you want to specialise in. But I always knew that it was sport. But you never told anybody that, because they didn't want you to get involved in sport at that time, because it meant you weren't working in the hospital. And at that time, again, there weren't that many jobs available as such in sport, because physios then, they did the sport, but they did it for nothing. They did it as a hobby, and it was all done after work and at weekends. There were very few paid physio jobs 40 years ago. I mean, even the football, they used to have first aiders rather than physios. A lot of the managers always thought that physios had got too much to say, with about the injured players. If it was a first aider, the manager could bully them into, having the players on the pitch, whereas a physio might have more to say. So quite a few managers didn't want qualified physios. So there weren't that many jobs, but gradually, obviously, that's improved. And I worked in London, as I say, in NHS hospitals. Then I went into private hospitals. In the evenings, I was the physio for Thames Valley Harriers for a while, and set up the sports injury clinic at the Sweatshop, which was Chris Brasher, who set up the London Marathon. He ran some big sports shops in Teddington in London, and we set up a sort of an advisory clinic for his customers there that did really well. And after a few years, I came back to Manchester, and again worked in a hospital. But once you're in sport, it's a very difficult environment to get out of. Not that I wanted to get out of it, but as I say, I knew so many people in sport, and they'd sort of say, "Oh, well, can you just come and cover this? Can you just come and cover that?" And I was asked to cover some swimming. I did a few sort of competitions and that, in British championships and things like that. And then I did a few internationals, junior internationals for the ASA, which is now GB Swimming. And then a friend of mine was a doctor with England Athletics, so I got involved with that, going and doing a few training camps in Africa, and did a few internationals there. And again, it was because of people I knew rather than anything else. And it was good fun, because you got experience in everything really. You sort of had a go at everything. And then I was working in a hospital that had a sports injury clinic, and the doctor there said, "Oh, have you ever done anything with football?" I said, "Oh, well, I've done bits and pieces, And he said, "Oh, well, Bury Football Club are looking for a physio, because their physios had to go into hospital. Can you come and cover for a couple of months?" So I said, "Oh, I'll give it a go." And that was it then. So ended up at Bury, and I was supposed to be there for a couple of months, and I was there for about 3 or 4 years.
And so what was that like then? Because I remember just a couple of questions. I suppose, what was the setup like? So it was before the degree side of things. So what constructed that education?
Well, in many ways, I think it was a better education, because we didn't do a thesis or anything like that. The students do a sort of a big project at the end of the third year. We spent our hours in the hospital, so we spent a lot more time clinically with hands-on, which in some respects, is what the job's all about. Whereas in others, I mean, obviously, students need to know how to extract information from articles. They need to know how to, understand whether an article's a good article or not, or if it's giving them good information. So there's pros and cons of all these things. But as I say, when it was a diploma, we spent a lot more time sort of in the hospitals, working with patients, rather than doing research or learning how to research. So that's the main difference, really. But yeah, it was very different, very different.
Yeah. So who were some of the other people around that time previously about?
Well, I mean, it's quite funny, really, because Dave Fever was the year below me. Rob Swires was a couple of years below that, all at Salford. So because when I trained, there were only two schools in the country. There was Salford and Pinderfields that actually took men. It was a massively female-dominated profession at that point. So, as I say, they just weren't set up to take men. So there's very, very few men in the profession. So all the guys that went on to football were either at Salford or Pinderfields. Yeah, so as I say, there was Dave and Dave Fever. I'm just trying to think who else. Ian Liversidge, who was at Newcastle for a while. He was another one that was a year below me. But yeah, so that was the sort of my contemporaries, if you like.
Yeah, no, it's great, and I know that like Mark Leather and Dave were over at Pinderfield. We've had a few people that came through that platform. So why do you think it was so northern centric then?
I'm not sure, really. I just think, I mean, I have to say, I mean, in years gone by, physio was very much a sort of what we always used to call it, a twin set and pearls profession, where it was very much hospital based, and it was a sort of a nice career for a girl to go into, sort of thing. I'm talking 50, 60 years ago. And then the men started barging in, because obviously the men started to set up private clinics, and a lot of the men went on into lecturing. That was where they tended to go. They didn't tend to go into the hospitals so much. And then, sports started to be taken more seriously, and they wanted more men, obviously, in cricket and rugby and football. Although saying that, again, in the early years, rugby, particularly rugby league, tended to have more girl physios than there were men. And I don't know whether they tended to want the qualified physios in rugby. And of course there weren't the men available, so they were happy to take the women on, and there were lots of physios, girl physios in rugby when I was early years, whereas when I went to Bury, I was the only physio in the football league. It was a woman, so that was quite interesting. There was a few interesting events happened around about that time. I can remember having to be escorted into the ground by the police once because the fans were, trying to stop me from getting in. And quite often, I always got questioned about going in the players' entrance, particularly from the opposition. They were very reluctant to let me in. I remember being rescued a few times by our team, saying, no, she's with us, just because it just wasn't expected. And then the next thing was trying to find somewhere to get changed, because there was never obviously a female toilet anywhere near the male dressing room. So I used to spend half an hour trying to find somewhere to get changed, and loads of times I've got changed on the bus, because there was never anywhere to get changed, so. So
yeah, what was that like then? How did you find that experience, other than it being just that's the way it was?
That's the way it was. You just got on with it. I wasn't going to get upset about it, because, that was just the way it was. And in a way, it was just such a sort of a male place, really. They just couldn't cater to women. But, couldn't expect anything else, really, So you just got on with it. You either didn't do it or you got on with it, and I just got on with it.
Like, what do you think, like, when you look at it now, do you think that is that like bad, or do you just think that is just what it was like?
That's development, isn't it? That's just, you look back at it, and let's be honest, it's not that long since women had the vote, so I can't complain about there not being female changing rooms at the football ground, So yeah, it's just development. I'm not sure there are so many more now, to be honest, but when you think, when I first started in football, probably sort of the early 90s, we were still in a lot of the old grounds. It's like, there's so many more new stadiums. Even the smaller clubs have got nice new stadium now. And then, and when they built these new stadiums, they built them to attract more females as well. So, there are better facilities now than there were then. But the facilities weren't built for females in the old days, It was a working man's thing to do on a Saturday afternoon after they'd been at work all week, was to go and watch the football. That wasn't, the wives didn't go with them, so they wouldn't think. I don't think it was done intentionally. That was just the way it was,
Yeah. And then, so how did you find it at Bury then? How long were you there for?
I was at Bury for about 3 or 4 years. It was interesting. I mean, from a physio's point of view, the physio room was probably smaller than a normal living room. I could get 2 couches in, and that was about it. We had no equipment. Oh, an ultrasound. We had an old ultrasound machine. The gym was sort of a room that had been dug out from underneath the stand, so it had sloping ceilings on one side. We had a few weights and a few sandbags, and if I wanted to do anything where they were running around or anything, they had no gym as I say, that was the room. We used to go in the social club and use the space in the social club, so you just had to make do and mend, really, because they didn't have any money. I was the only physio, I was the only medical person at the club, and I used to cover the first team, the reserve team, and any of the kids that got injured. I used to do the lot, because the doctor used to come in once a week, and the game for a shot of whiskey. That was how it was. that was what it was like.
And what was that like, managing in that environment then? So was that just, again, was it just it was what it was?
It didn't know any different, you see. You didn't, that was the way it was at the time. And obviously you knew that there were places that were far better, equipped and things. But I mean, that's how it was, and you just got on with it. And I think one of the things about being a physio, you learn how to manage. You just learn to get on with it. And one of the things that an old physio lecturer I had, who was part of the England Rugby League setup, and he always used to say, "There's no plugs in the middle of a field. You've got to get on, and you should be just as good a physio with your hands as you are, with all this fancy machinery," he used to say. And in a way he was right. You should be able to be a very competent physio, even without equipment. And you see, when you travel with teams, a lot of the time I used to travel with teams, and I was, there was never any doctor around or anything, but we didn't have any equipment. We didn't maybe take an ultrasound, because you could fit that in the bag, but you couldn't take anything else, because you didn't have the capacity to do it, you know. And then when you got to wherever you were going, you know, the physio room was usually the physio's bedroom. You know, that's how it works.
Yeah.
So you learn how to, you know, use your hands, a lot of massage, a lot of manipulation, a lot of, you know, mobilization. And I think that's still true to a certain extent in sport, rather than relying on you know, machinery, particularly when you're on the move so much.
Yeah. So how many hours were you doing at Bury then?
I went the whole year without a day off at one point. Even Christmas Day, we used to train on Christmas Day because they always had a game on Boxing Day. But as I say, I was covering, you know, the first team at the weekends, and again, it was a 3 o'clock kickoff on a Saturday afternoon then. And then I used to cover the reserves during the week. So, and we had I used to have a few up and downers with the manager, because he always used to think that, you know, you had to inconvenience injured players because then they wouldn't want to be injured, you know. And why would a player want to be injured? I've no idea. But, you know, inconvenience them, bring them in, you know, that in the evening and this and that. Yeah, but you're inconveniencing me as well, you know. I'm working all hours God sends and you're inconveniencing me, you know, so I'm not prepared to do it, you know. So but that's what they were like, you see. That's the managers used to think they could dictate everything, you know. And I said, well, you know, when you get your physio degree, then let's have a conversation. But until then, you let me decide when they're coming in and how often I see them, you know.
But around that time, the managers or coaches were the physios, weren't they? I know that when I was chatting with Graham Smith about certainly the Liverpool setup, that Roy Evans or whoever it was at the time, they were considered the part of the medical team.
Yeah, well, I mean, when I went to Bury, the physio at Bury was Wilf McGuinness. And he'd been at Bury for 10 years and you know, had got a few first aid qualifications, and he was the physio, you know, and he'd gone into hospital, and that's why they were short. But around about that time they did change the manager, and then this new manager actually wanted a qualified physio, which was great. And then when Wilf was out of hospital, he became the kit man. I stayed on as the physio, and he became the kit man. He was much happier like that because he didn't like the responsibility, and quite rightly, he hadn't got the knowledge, you know. But he was more normal than I was in a way. You know, there were very few qualified physios in the league at that time, particularly at the lower levels, because they couldn't afford to pay them, you know. But you know, that's how it was, you know. Yeah.
So what do you make of the Bury predicament of what's happened with them?
I thought it was scandalous. I thought it was very, very sad. And you see that what's always amazed me about football is that you get these really successful businessmen going into football clubs, and it's almost like all the business acumen sort of leaves the head as soon as they walk through the front door, and they just do some ridiculous things, which, you know, I mean, they just seem to lose all the business sense. And obviously there's so many clubs, and especially now after COVID, there's so many clubs struggling. But it was very sad because we were sponsored by a guy who was a Bury guy, multimillionaire, who, if I'm correct, I might be wrong, but if I'm correct, he was involved, and people may or may not remember this, the Polypec scandal where there was this big business scandal, and they froze all his assets. So all the income going into the club was just suddenly frozen. So they virtually couldn't afford to pay any of the players, and they went from a really prosperous club where we, you know, every weekend we were staying at a fancy hotel, etc., with nice coaches, to sort of traveling everywhere on the day. I mean, I can even remember doing Brighton in a day. So we drove down to Brighton on the day of the game and drove straight back because they couldn't afford to pay for hotels. And then they had to sell most of the better players, and bring part-timers in. So then we started to have to train 2 or 3 evenings a week as well as during the day, to allow the part-timers to come in. So it was a real trial, and that was 30 years ago. And I think they were living from hand to mouth right through to when it all finished.
Yeah,
and it was very sad. It was very sad because it was a smashing club and fabulous. I mean, Bury's ground, Gig Lane, the pitch at Gig Lane used to be known as one of the best pitches in the Football League. And then because they were having so much, financial difficulties, they allowed the rugby in. I can't remember which club it was now. One of the rugby clubs came in, and of course that just destroyed the pitch, to be honest. But up to that point, Gig Lane, the pitch was just absolutely fabulous. One of the best playing surfaces at that level, if not any level. But then that was all, all destroyed, really. So yeah, very sad, very sad. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's awful when any club that's got such a long history goes out of business. So yeah, no, it's terrible. So after Bury, then where did you move on to?
So I went from Bury and I went to manage a physio department in a private hospital in Bolton, and because once you're in football, you're in football, and it was a nice department, and we had a small pool and we had ice kinetics, and so we started getting. And one of the surgeons actually used to work for the the ex-players association, so we used to get a lot of footballers in. And then when they realised that I was there and we've got some good rehab facilities, a lot of the local professional clubs used to send the long-term injured players to us, rather than them being at the club, because it sort of gave them a better sort of rehab, because they were given better facilities, and also it helped the club physios to do the day-to-day sort of injuries that needed to be sorted out straight away. And sometimes I think when you were, and again in those days, you might only have one or two physios. There was too much work for you to have a real good sort of rehabilitation process with the long-term injured, because you had to get players ready for the next game. So you were spending time with them rather than the long-term players. So it was handy, really, them coming to us, because they were local. We were talking to the physios all the time, and the players felt as if they were being looked after, better, or getting a better rehab, which they were, to be honest, because there weren't many clubs in the area who would have a hydrotherapy pool and ice kinetics. Even the first division clubs in the Premier League clubs at that time.
Yeah.
So it was great, really, and we used to get players from Oldham and Preston, and I mean that was when Oldham was in the Premier League, and I mean Manchester City, we had a few players, and all the low Blackburn, Bolton, of course, and they would all be in together. We used to have a real good crack, good fun with all the players in, but they worked hard as well, and to be honest with you, the public liked to see it as well, because the players were always great with the public, and they were sometimes doing things with general public, and everybody just got on with it, and it was really good fun.
Yeah, can't imagine that happening anymore. But
no, and it was an unusual situation, but it worked for the time, and at the same time I was doing the England women's job, and Altrincham at the same time, so I was sort of kept busy. And then I just decided and I think too busy, and I just decided to sort of throw it all in at the same time. Within a week, I just resigned everything. I just needed a break, and then decided I was going to go back to university to get a degree, because I still hadn't got a degree at this point. And there's all these new physios coming out now with a degree, and I'm thinking, I'm falling a long way behind. So I went to Salford to do a master's in sports rehab. I was invited by the guy who set it up to go and do it. Didn't enjoy it at all. I didn't enjoy it. So I did my postgraduate diploma, and then another friend of mine who was one of the tutors at Manchester University, well, the Manchester Physio School, asked me if I wanted to do my MPhil through Manchester University, through the medical school there, which I did. And I just funded it all myself because I just wanted to do it. And then, so for 3 years, I was working in private practice and other people's private practice, just ticking along, really. But then that's when I got involved with the divers. So again, I'd been asked to do a couple of things for the Amateur Swimming Association, as it was then, which I'd done. And obviously, because I wasn't working anywhere, I could just sort of do it sort of quite short notice. And they said to me, do I fancy covering a junior diving tournament competition? It was the World Championships, actually. So I said, oh yeah, I'll give it a go. So I travelled to Czechoslovakia in the back of Beyond and spent time with the divers and really enjoyed it, and ended up spending 10 years with the Great Britain diving team. Travelled all over the world with them, doing Grand Prix all over the world and European Championships, World Championships, did Japan and Australia and all sorts, which was really good fun. And then I got my masters, and then the United job came up, and so I thought, well, I'll give that a go.
Just to go back to what you mentioned about doing the course at Salford, then, so the sports rehab. What was it that you hated about
that? Well, it was the first time they'd ever run it, so they were starting off, and they had some very young lecturers in who I didn't feel had the experience to try and teach me how to, in a way. They'd never worked in a clinical field. They'd just gone on, they'd done the degree, done the masters, and then got a job as a tutor. And I'd been working for 20 years at that point. It was a very different environment for me because I'd never, done essays like they were expecting. I'd never, spent time in the library like they were expecting, because we just didn't do it when I was. And we didn't have a personal tutor, and it just wasn't the right time, and I just didn't feel we got the support that they just expected us to carry on as if we were degree people, and we weren't. A lot of us weren't, so it just didn't sit right with me at all. But then when I went over to Manchester University, the guy who was my personal tutor knew very well where I'd come from, and gave me a lot of support, and that's when I got through that, and I got the job at United. And it was Sir Alex that said, well, do you want to do your PhD? And I went, oh, I'd not really, I thought masters, oh, that's enough, do you want to do your PhD? And I went, yeah, all right. He said the club will support you to do it, and they did very much, and I just did that. I finished my masters and went straight on to do my PhD. But by that time I'd started working at United.
So was that quite early on that he said that to you then?
On my interview.
Really? Right.
Yeah.
So how did that, why do you think he, obviously to do that with someone he's not even recruited, why did he want you for starters? And then why do you think that he was looking to offer that straight away?
Well, I'd met him a couple of times, and I knew a lot of the coaches at United because they'd actually been, players at Bury and various other clubs, so I knew a lot of the coaches, so they knew me, and I knew Rob, who was the head physio there, and I knew Mike Stone, who was the doctor, so they knew of me, and they knew I was doing my masters. But the thing about Sir Alex was he had such an inquiring mind. He was just like, he was a sponge for any sort of knowledge in anything, whether it was, obviously you couldn't tell him anything about football, but sport in general, he was like, you could have gone as a sports specialist, but even, everything else. And the thing about, I was going in to lead the physio team in the academy. And what he wanted was, he said to me at the interview, I want to know why kids get injured that badly that they have to finish. I want to know that, and I want you to tell me. And that was, in his words, that's what he wanted. He said, I'm fed up of kids, coming over, maybe from Ireland or something, and having really bad injuries, and us not being able to help them, and for them to have to give up their careers, and then there's got so much potential, and I want it stopping. That was how he was. And I want you to, think about doing your PhD, and that's what I want you to look at. And I mean, that was just fit straight into the job. You see, it was ideal, and so that's what I did.
That does sound pretty amazing. You've got someone like that coming in and being able to support you into something to progress you.
All the while I was doing it, he was like saying, "Well, what are you doing now, and why are you doing that?" And well, tell me, don't cover it in fancy academic language. Just tell me it straight. What does it mean? He was massively supported, and always wanted to know what was going on and what we were doing, and how we were doing it, and why, what difference did it make, and that was the environment that we worked in at United, to be frank, because he was like that, not just with me, but with all the staff. He was certainly like that with the medical staff, massively supportive of the medical staff. But with all the staff, whether you were in the laundry or on reception or on the the greenkeepers, whatever, you knew that you'd got his backing. If you backed him, he would back you 110%. And that's what made it so successful, I think, because you knew I'd have done anything for him. You'd have bent over backwards to do anything he wanted you to do, because you knew he was supporting you so much. And he was such an amazing personality, really. Best boss I've ever worked with, without a doubt. So amazing experience to be, to have him as a boss for 10 years,
No, definitely. And then because when he left, there's been a bit of a tail off from there. But is that why you think that the team was so successful for that long period of time?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, he could make a team out of anything, really. It showed after he left, really, the team, which was the same team, didn't do anywhere near as well. And I mean, the players would work the socks off for him. They would really try as hard as they could for him, because he was, as I say, so supportive of the team, and you just wanted to do your best for him, but it took a very special personality to get that sort of reaction. And that, there's very few people like that around.
Yeah. So how did you find doing that work then? Have you worked in an academy type setup before?
Not as such, because there just weren't there weren't that many environments around, and the academies has only been set up. I think that the Premier League, the Football League, the FA set up the academies in '98, and I joined United in 2000. So they were still very new, and they were still sort of finding the feet in a way. And it was only when they'd set them up, and one of the stipulations was that they had to have a chartered physio, as the physio in the academy, and a lot of clubs were struggling, to get them. But that was the first time, really, that there was a more organised youth structure in any sport, really. Obviously the football clubs had youth, but they didn't start until they were called associate schoolboy players, and they weren't allowed to play for like United or City or whatever until they were 15 or 16. So, and a lot of them were past, the growth time. So before the academies were set up, they didn't join the club until they signed as a 16-year-old. There was none of this, none of these younger teams existed. So they didn't have the medical staff in the clubs to deal with these youngsters. So it was all very new. Yeah.
And then how much link was there between the first team players then in the academy at that point?
Well, at United, it was very strong because of the boss. You know, I mean, he was always bobbing over to the academy. And then, I mean, on a Sunday morning when all the academy games took place, usually the first team was doing a warm down from the game the day before, and many of them would stroll over to watch the games. Certainly the boss, every time he used to come over to watch what was going on. And a lot of the first team used to come over, especially they'd come over to watch the 15s or 16s play, because they knew that those were the boys that'd be coming up, you know, in the following few years. So, and then when the players, the first team players, they all tended to do the coaching badges just as a sort of a rite of passage, really. They also do all the practice in the academy, you know, so that all the kids, you know, they had Paul Scholes or, you know, Gary Neville or the Phil Neville doing, you know, coaching drills with them, you know, so that was, you know, great. But I mean, that was one of the things with Sir Alex. Again, he wanted everybody on the same ground. He didn't want to split, like, you know, I mean, Everton had a split and then Liverpool had the split, where, you know, initially the academy was in a completely different place to the first team changing. But Sir Alex said, no, we're not split. We are Manchester United and we stay together. You know, we're on the same grounds, and that's why they got Carrington, because it was so big and it could accommodate everybody, you see. So and it meant that he could sort of bob over sometimes in an evening, even, you know, he'd bob over and you know, you knew when he was in the building because all the parents used to stand to attention, you know. It was quite funny, but no, he took a massive interest in what was going on, of course, you know. So,
yeah, I can imagine it must have been an amazing time to be involved in such a successful era of any sport, really.
Yeah. Oh, it was fabulous. Yeah. I mean, I think for the 10 years I was there, I think we won something every season. I don't think there was one season we didn't, you know, even if it was, I'm not just going to say just the League Cup, but even if it was the League Cup, we won something, you know. So yeah, it was a massively exciting time, really. Yeah. Particularly if you were a United fan.
Yeah. And so in terms of leaving there then, how did that come about?
Well, you know, times were changing, and we went over to Qatar. We went over to Aspire Academy with the team, and I was approached while I was there by the doctor of Aspire Academy, who asked me if I'd be interested in the job. And, you know, a new exciting environment, and I mean the facilities were just like phenomenal. And then right next to Aspire was Aspetar Orthopedic Hospital, which is probably one of the most, you know, best orthopedic sports medicine and orthopedic hospitals around. So and the personnel that were working there were just, you know, everybody that was anybody in sports medicine was either attached to the hospital or worked at the hospital. So you know, when you come to 10 years, you think, well, you know, I might just go for a change, which I did. And I just thought, well, just, you know, I've always been very much, you know, well, let's give it a go, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But, you know, I'd hate to think in a few years, or to say, if only I'd done that. So I took the plunge, and it was a fabulous experience. Loved it, and I still miss it now. You know, I really enjoyed it. I had a great lifestyle. You know, good fun, some really good people. I mean, you know, we were talking previously about Phil Graham-Smith and Marco Cardinale, who's a, you know, world famous physiologist, and all the main people in sports medicine, Roald Barr and Rod Whiteley, a physio from Australia, and Karim Khan, who's the editor of the BASM Journal. They were all there. And so again, it's connections, isn't it? You make connections, and it was a really good time. And that's when I started doing more research, because we had the facilities. We'd got the people there to do it as a group, and in fact, I'm still connected with the guys at Aspire, and we're still researching the data that we collected in the 8 years I was there. So,
could you see that they were trying to build up to getting major events then at that point? Was that why they were investing?
Yeah, well, what they decided because it's the royal family basically who run Qatar. They are the government, if you like, but they could see how sport brought everybody together and it gave the country kudos. I mean, you only need to see what happens if we win a major, tournament, the World Cup, or when we won the Rugby World Cup, or the Cricket World Cup, or whatever, how it sort of galvanizes everybody really, and they could see that. And also they wanted to bring publicity to the country. They wanted to, highlight the country, and to be frank, they had copious amounts of money. I mean, the bottomless pit, so they could afford to build the facilities to put on, world-class events. So, and there are fewer and fewer places that can afford to do that. And I have to say, I mean, when I was there, they were building the World Cup stadia. And now they've all been finished. And I was looking at them, I think, in the last couple of weeks, and they're absolutely phenomenal stadia. It'll be an amazing World Cup, and especially as every stadium can be reached within probably an hour. So you can go to different games from different group stages, on the same day. So it'll be great for that. But they've built a new racing circuit. It looks like they're going to get a Grand Prix. They do motor Grand Prix there. They have Grand Prix in the swimming Grand Prix every year, the athletics Grand Prix. They have the tennis there every year. That's just finished. They have a fencing Grand Prix. Gymnastics are there. And as an employee, I mean, I just got into all these events for free. So I mean, if you're into sport, it's fantastic. Golf. They have a big golf tournament every year. With all the main players.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
It's fantastic, really, and everywhere's so close. So,
do you think you'll get over for the World Cup then?
No. I'm going to give it a miss. I think it'll be a bit manic, to be honest. But I'd really, I mean, I hope it goes well for them, to be honest, because I have a real soft spot for Qatar, and I know they've had a lot of bad press, and a lot of bad press from people who don't know what's going on. And I'm not condoning the way that some of the workers are treated, but I also know how these workers live when they're in their own countries. I mean, I've spent quite a bit of time traveling the world, and I've been to Nepal a few times, and particularly after the last earthquake, the devastation in Nepal was just unbelievable, and the number of people that were living on the streets. And those people are coming over and earning money that they're able to send back to the families in Nepal. So, I mean, as I say, I'm not sort of saying, everything's rosy. I know it's not. But at least these guys are actually making money to send back to the families, which they wouldn't be able to if they were in their own countries.
Yeah.
So it's not an easy problem, but a lot of people are shouting off about it, and they don't really know the circumstances. And even during the time I was there were massive changes for the positive for these workers. As I say, I'm not saying it was everything was hunky dory. I'm not saying that at all, but certainly things had massively improved in the last 10 years. So. And if they weren't in Qatar, they'd be in Saudi. I think that over in Saudi, they're treated a lot less fairly than they are in Qatar.
Mm.
So yeah, well, interesting. It's very I don't think there's any simple answer to it.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I have got a soft spot for Qatar. I really enjoyed living there. It was a very progressive country, and the very again, you hear all these stories about, women's rights and things, but I was there on my own. I lived there on my own. I was driving. I didn't have to wear any special dress. So I was, and I felt a lot safer over there than I do over in Manchester, if I'm being frank. So again, a lot of people, shouting their mouths off when they don't know what's going on. in the government in Qatar. They've got loads of women, a lot of women, head up big corporations, big education. The big foundations are all run by women, which they're not in other Arab nations,
Yeah, that's really interesting. No, it's good that you found it such a stimulating and a good time.
Yeah.
So what brought you back from there then?
Again, things were changing, and family. You're away from your family. My mother was still alive, but not so well, and I decided to come home, and wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I hadn't been home for very long, and I was invited to go out to help them build an academy in the Punjab in India. And it was with a few people that I'd worked with in Qatar who were heading up the football. So I wasn't out there full time, but I was going every month. I was going for 2 weeks. So I was home for 2 weeks, out there for 2 weeks, and I did that for 12 months. And that is a massive untapped sort of pot of talent in India, because sport, again, it's only just starting to open up. Apart from the cricket and the hockey, obviously they're massive things over in India, but there's football and a bit more tennis, and athletics are doing more, and there's a bit more money going into it, a few more academies being built, so it's a sort of an expanding arena, and then obviously all that came to a standstill when COVID hit, and I came back. Spent a couple of years and thinking, I'm getting on a bit, and I don't want to be running on any pitches, and about time I retired and just got bored basically. So I was doing a few online lectures, and people were asking me to do various presentations, and then marking a few PhDs, and then the opportunity came for me to go to Manchester Met to do physio. So I said, yeah, all right, I'll give it a go and see if I enjoy it, and I've loved it. so that's the story up to its point, and I never know what's going to happen in the future, because I don't plan anything,
Yeah.
It's just the way the wind turns, really,
Yeah, well, now I know you're just down the road. I'll definitely pop in and say hello. But just a couple more questions before we finish then. So you've had an extensive career. Like, for one, what would your advice be for someone wanting to get into this area?
I think one of the big things today is one of the things that we used to do when we were sort of getting on. We used to do a lot of things for nothing. Today, a lot of people expect to get paid for the time. Well, sometimes, it's not just money, it's experience that's worth so much to you. And I mean, we used to, do things at weekends and in evenings just to learn and to get connections, and don't be frightened of doing that, because those connections can be worth far more than a bit of money in the bank, and it just helps you learn and broaden your knowledge in the specific area that you may want to work in. And then the other thing was that when I was younger, I used to pay for all the courses I went on. I didn't expect people to pay. I didn't expect hospitals to pay for me, or employers, because I wanted to learn and I wanted to make connections. Again, you go to conferences, and that's where you make your connections, and that's where you meet people, and for youngsters these days, and one of the things I say to the students I'm dealing with, never fail to ask questions. The more questions you can ask, the better, and that's what educators want, and the students that are on placements, ask your seniors questions, because if you don't ask questions, they think you're all right, ask questions, and the more questions, the better, and they enjoy it more because they can talk about what they're doing then, you see, as well. So I think that's the main thing, really, is be inquisitive, and don't be expected to be paid for everything, because there's more than there's more than just money. It's education, and that the value of that is second to none, really. In your early years, I'm not expecting everybody to do everything for nothing, but expect to do some things on a voluntary basis just to gain that experience, because it's priceless, really.
No, it's interesting you mentioned about the questions, because I think that's great in any walk of life. But I also think it's good to ask them when you're younger. Like, I know that when we go into places, even senior people, they may not want to ask questions in front of their peers, or like, what's your experience around that?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same in every walk of life, isn't it? You don't want to be seen to be, you know, or lacking in knowledge, if you like. But I've always been of the case, well, I'm not bothered what anybody else thinks. I want to know something, and I'll ask the question, you know. And you just got to, you know, even say, well, you know, I might be being a bit thick here, but you know what's the answer to this, or what's the answer to that? You know, make a joke of it, but you're still getting the answer to your question. And don't be frightened. I think that's the thing, you know. And I think there's so much pressure on youngsters today, you know. I mean, youngsters and students today that they're almost sort of competing against each other all the time, and just forget all about that and just think about, you know, learning as much as possible while you've got the environment there to do it in a university, or, you know, on a placement or whatever, and just get as much out of the experience as you possibly can. And you know, that's the best thing I can say to them, really.
Yeah, no, very good advice. And then last question, out of all the things that you've done, what would you say has been the most memorable? One or two things, if you can limit it to that.
Well, certainly working for Sir Alex was the most fabulous experience, because he was such a, I mean, I'm not saying he was a nice man, but he was such a personality, and he was really funny. I mean, we had some really good times with him, you know. So that would be, you know, good. But also just thinking of some of the great people I've met over my journey, you know. And I mean, I can remember when I was doing my masters and excuse me, my PhD, I had a personal tutor who's he was the most supportive of guys, and just, you know, being thankful to these people that helped me along the way, you know. I mean, going to big cup finals that Manchester United always took the staff to. Any big cup final that we got to, we were always taken as a treat, if you like. So some of those, but even just going to World Championships in Japan, and going to all these different places. I mean, there's just so many different things that have, you know, been highlights, if you like, but so many, you know. Yeah, really, when I look back at it, I feel very lucky to have been able to be given the opportunity to take up so many of these fabulous things, and seen fabulous things, and, you know, been to really unusual places. And I mean, I've been to China a few times with the divers, and, you know, I mean, with the football, I've been all over the world with football. But yeah, I mean, it's just, I mean, what other career could you get that in, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that's a good way to finish. But yeah, Mandy, really appreciate your time on it. Thank you. I know you've had COVID recently, so again, thanks for finding the time for it.
Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Cheers, Mandy. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.